I remember the night my father died like it was yesterday. I was literally about to leave my apartment to go to work in the bar where I was the deputy manager. I was finishing off an episode of The Sopranos when my phone started to ring. For some reason, I got it into my head that it would be work calling, asking if I could come in earlier or some other nonsense reason. So, I took my time to answer, and when I did, it was incredibly nonchalantly. If I had to describe the emotion at that moment, it was boredom, but a boredom that wouldn't last. The news hit like a freight train. He had died suddenly, unexpectedly, of some kind of blood clot in his brain. One moment he was healthy and happy, the next, he was being announced dead on arrival. The funeral was rough. It sounds cruel to say, but I feel like if a relative is old or has some kind of terminal illness, at least the family and friends have time to prepare, to ready themselves for the loss. But with us, we didn't have that time. It was like going from 0 to 100 in seconds flat, bored to grief-stricken in the time it took to say, "I have some bad news." So instead of the kind of unwilling acceptance that characterized the funerals I've been to in the past, there was just this shell-shocked sense of loss. Everyone had taken this 1-2 punch and was walking around in a daze, unable to fully process the loss they were feeling. I've never been big on visiting graves either. It sounds a bit callous, but what's the point? It's only ever to comfort the living. The dead don't know we do it, and quite frankly, I would want someone to remember me, sure, but some ritual visitation that brings up all these feelings of mortality and impermanence. Nah, just raise a beer glass for me. That's all I want when I'm gone. But when it came to my dad, I had next to no closure whatsoever. So I ended up going against my own previously held convictions, scrambling for that sense of attachment, desperate to feel like he wasn't really gone. Weekly visits became monthly visits, all with the same routine. I'd drink a can of his favorite lager over his grave, talk to him a little bit about what's been going on in my life. It never made me feel any better, but I could feel myself taking baby steps along the grief cycle each time I walked away. It was helping, in a small way, but it was still helping. And so the little ritual played itself out, in exactly the same way, until one day, when I saw an unfamiliar man standing near where he was buried. He was dressed entirely in black, wearing a long coat with a similarly dark umbrella under his arm. It wasn't clear if the man was visiting my father's gravesite or simply one near it, but as I walked closer and he caught sight of me, he quickly began to walk away from the gravestones and towards one of the cemetery's exits. Nothing unusual about that, right? People are entitled to grieve in privacy, I get that. So I didn't really think anything of it. That was until it happened all over again, in exactly the same way. I put it down to coincidence the second time around, but as the second time became a third time of seeing that same guy standing near the headstones, I started to think something weird was going on. The third time, I tried to approach out of sight, as quietly as possible. I wanted to figure out if he really was visiting my father's grave, not just one of those close to it. That's when I realized he was. I watched from a distance as he knelt down near the headstone and touched it for a second. I didn't recognize him from the funeral, and although I couldn't exactly see his face, I knew for certain that he wasn't someone I knew or someone I'd met before, even in passing. My curiosity got the better of me, and I made up my mind to get to the bottom of whatever was happening. I kept my stealthy approach, staying light on my feet and out of sight as I got closer and closer to the gravesite. But as I leveled with him, he turned, saw me, and got this look of pure shock in his eyes. Then he actually started running in the opposite direction from me, hurtling through the graves towards an exit. I just sort of reacted and chased after him. It was that or face the possibility of never getting another chance. After such a confrontational approach, he might never visit my father's grave again, and for the second time, I would be left in the dark with no closure whatsoever. And there was not a single chance in hell that I was going to let that happen again. And so that's how I came to be chasing a guy through a goddamn cemetery, running full pelt, screaming at him to stop, how I just wanted to talk to him. The handful of other visitors looked on in a mix of shock and disgust, unable to quite believe how someone could be so disrespectful around the final resting places of so many of their loved ones. But if I'm honest, I really didn't care. I knew that if they were in my place, they'd be doing exactly the same thing. I caught up with the guy near one of the exits, actually managing to grab hold of his arm at one point, pulling so that the guy was forced to spin around as a result of his own momentum. What I saw made me feel sick to my stomach. The face that I saw, barely covered by the black scarf anymore, was the face of my father. It was identical in every way, only the way he carried himself, minor perceptions of body language and stature, was much different than I remembered. When he spoke, it sent my head swimming. My father was from the south of England, and his accent reflected that, but this guy had a distinctly Scottish accent. At least, that's what it sounded like. It definitely wasn't my dad's accent. He told me to leave him alone before he took off again, and God help me, I did. My legs were jelly, and not just from the burst of sprinting that my decidedly unathletic self had conjured up. I couldn't move. I just couldn't bring myself to follow him. After a sit-down discussion with my mom, the only thing we can agree upon is that the man must have been my father's identical twin. She had seen his body, after all. She had identified him at the morgue. There was no way he had faked his own death or any of the other overly paranoid things I initially suggested. But as my mom asserted, he had never, ever mentioned having a brother, let alone a twin. It's something we're obviously going to look into, because if this guy is who we think he is, some long-lost sibling of my dad's, then I'd really like to get in touch with him. For the longest time, I was a tombstone caretaker for a cemetery in rural Georgia. It was only a summertime job for a 16-year-old, nothing too crazy, just cleaning off the grime and built-up dirt from the tombstones and such. Now, to kind of set the scene a little, the cemetery included one building that housed bathrooms for the 5 caretakers employed by the cemetery, in addition to one small, simple mausoleum. Other than that, it was just all flat earth with tombstones littering the entire site. The whole place felt pretty cut off too, as surrounding the area were some of the densest forests in the entire state of Georgia. Naturally, because of the eerie surroundings, I was always a little bit more paranoid than maybe I should have been. That, combined with my penchant for watching a lot of horror movies, created a terrible combo for someone working in a cemetery. So, one night, I was doing my rounds when I had to go into the small mausoleum. We had some of the wealthier families in the area entombed within, and it was my job to go in, make sure everything was neat and clean, and ensure it met the standards for these affluent folks. As I walked over to it, I immediately felt like something was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, just this general sense that I wasn't alone. That's when I noticed candlelight coming from the small mausoleum. I was also pretty certain that I could hear voices coming from inside, voices of younger people, kids around my age at the time. They were giggling and laughing, but it didn't sound particularly wholesome. I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave the cemetery, but I also wasn't about to potentially take on a bunch of drunk teenagers on my own, as I would definitely get my ass kicked. So, I called the lone security officer on duty, a retired cop who did a few rounds on the lot. He was tough, and I knew he would jump at the chance to help me out. When the ex-cop finally turned up, we both went inside the mausoleum. It was empty, which made absolutely no sense as I had literally just heard voices and stuff inside. There were indeed lit candles burning around one of the tombs, a tomb that had been opened up, revealing the remains of a child-sized skeleton. Nothing else was disturbed, but that alone was horrifying enough. The open tomb contained a rotten old child's doll, one of those knitted ones. It was seriously disturbing to see that old thing, smiling away while lying hand in hand with an actual child skeleton. The security guard and I quickly got out of there, doing a lightning sweep of the grounds to try to at least catch a glimpse of the sick individuals who had desecrated that girl's final resting place. Neither of us saw a soul, which was more frustrating than it was scary. After about a quarter of an hour, we met back at the mausoleum to set the girl's grave in order by sliding the stone tablet back on top of the tomb. But when we stepped inside, the doll that was previously hand in hand with the dead girl was sitting on the other side of the mausoleum. It was just sitting there, upright, with that same uneven smile stitched across her face. Whoever was messing with us had actually gone back to move that doll, to taunt us. I quit the next day and never went back, not even to visit. Right after I dropped out of high school and moved out of my parents' house, I needed work, real bad. I would have done pretty much anything for rent money at that time in my life, so I'm lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, that the local cemetery needed employees. At first, the old-timers who had been working there for 20 or 30 years just wondered why someone so young would ever want to be a gravedigger. It was tough work, hell on the lower back, but I soon adjusted, and it turned out to be something more akin to a free gym membership than an actual job. I mean, I got swole pretty goddamn fast. If I'm honest, it only ever felt like work if the weather was bad or we had an actual funeral on site. Otherwise, it was just nice to be able to spend time outdoors. So, the way our cemetery was set up was pretty simple. The majority of the grounds were just regular grave sites, all pretty much the same size and same price. But the northwest corner of the grounds was a private site that contained much larger plots. These were reserved for wealthier families, and the local undertaker made a lot of cash from selling extravagant grave setups to them. I'm talking whole mausoleums, statues of angels, stuff like that. We hardly ever visited that area of the site, except for cleaning and maintenance duties, and those were never assigned to me. I didn't take it personally, but the older guys just didn't trust me with all the cleaning chemicals and whatnot that kept the marble and brass fixtures looking fresh. Which is why it was so weird when I got a phone call on one of my days off, asking me if I had been up to that area recently. My boss was pissed, I could hear it in his voice, and he pulled no punches when he asked me if I had been screwing around in the northwest plots. Of course, I told him no, that the last time I had been up there was to watch one of the old-timers using the marble cleaning chemical as part of my training. And that had been months back. He sighed, seemed confused and confounded, so I asked him what exactly the issue was. He replied that it could wait until the next time I was at work. I was worried, sure, but I was pretty sure that I hadn't done anything wrong, not deliberately anyway, and especially nothing that involved the northwest plots. A couple of days later, when I rolled into work, the atmosphere was tense as hell. I knew something fairly serious had happened. All I knew was that I wouldn't have to badger anyone to find out why. The boss man walked me out to the northwest plot, silent the whole way, and I knew better than to open my mouth until I found out exactly what was going on. There was already a worker up in the plot, tending to one of the graves. That's when my boss told me that if I had been hanging around the area, maybe during my lunch break, eating a few snacks among the opulent grave sites, now would be the time to tell him. I swore to God that I hadn't, that I knew better than to eat stuff near the graves, as I had been well informed, it attracts wild animals that can, in turn, do damage to some of the resting places. That's when he broke it down for me. Something had tried to dig up one of the freshly dug graves in the northwest plots. He said something in particular, and not someone, because we each had enough experience to recognize when a grave had been dug with tools or by hand, or in this case, by claw. It was rough around the edges, obvious claw marks in the dirt as opposed to the straight lines carved out by a shovel. This was something of an emergency, I mean, for obvious sanitary reasons, but for sentimental reasons too. If local families discovered that wild animals were trying to dig up their deceased relatives, there would be an uproar. Something had to be done, and quickly. A meeting was called among the grave diggers and attendants. As far as we knew, the mysterious digging had taken place overnight and was most likely undertaken by some kind of scavenger animal, a coyote, a black bear, maybe even an escaped dog. The solution was obvious: night watchmen would have to be present in the cemetery every night until the situation was resolved. And guess who was voluntold to be the night watchman for the first full week? You guessed it. The young guy, the new guy, me. The only thing that made the proposal even vaguely attractive was the fact that anyone doing the night work would be paid double the regular rate, and I could definitely have done with the extra cash. The first night of being on watch really sucked. All I had for company was a flask of strong coffee and a .22 pellet gun loaned to me by one of the other workers to take down any varmints. It was long, boring, and lonely, but once I adjusted my sleeping pattern, it got a little easier. Then, on the second to last night of my watchman duties, I was on a little foot patrol, walking up towards the northwest plot with a flashlight in my hand. That's when I saw it, a flurry of frantic limbs, digging at the earth. I could have shouted something, maybe even fired the .22 in the air to scare the animal away, but something in me wanted to end this whole thing right then and there. If I killed whatever critter was causing us so much trouble, I might be out of the extra pay, but at least I'd have my daytime life back. I crept up slowly, turning the flashlight off and sneaking stealthily towards the dark shape working away at the earth. I've hunted rabbits at night with my uncle before, so I figured I'd use the old flashlight technique to cause the animal to freeze for a second so I could take the killing shot. But when I aimed that powerful flashlight in the direction of the digging thing, I almost cried out in fear. It wasn't an animal at all, it was a human, crouched on all fours, digging away at the earth with his or her bare hands. I couldn't bring myself to aim the rifle, I was too shocked at what I was looking at. So all I did was start making as much noise as possible, telling them to get out of there, saying I'd call the cops if they didn't comply. They complied all right, but not out of fear. The look in that person's eyes was one of fury, pure anger that they'd been interrupted in their obscene little act. I swear, if I hadn't had that rifle with me, if I hadn't had the means to defend myself that were obvious to them, I honestly don't know if I'd be here today to tell this story. Needless to say, the other workers didn't believe what I saw. Some of them told me they didn't doubt that I had seen something, they just disputed what that thing was. And I get that, I really do, but still, I know what I saw. And it was definitely a person.